Daniel Jose Gaztambide. I had a hard time in the beginning of the episode pronouncing his name, right? Daniel, he's a brilliant mind. I can just sit and listen to him speak in politics for a really long time. And he recently wrote two books, right? That I think it's worth anyone who wants to explore and think about the cultural aspects of being a therapist, right? And how culture plays a role, cultural social issue plays a role in being a therapist. His latest book is called Decolonizing Psychoanalytic Techniques, right? Putting Freud on Fanon's couch. And his first book was A People's History of Psychoanalysis, from Freud to Liberation Psychology. Um, Daniel, he's a brilliant mind. He talks about a bit of his theory and a bit how to engage the patient and how to explore the concept of identities, right? Race, cultural issues that might come up in the therapeutic room, and how do we make sense of that, and how that's always at play, right? He's able to sort of bring in historical context to some of this, and he's also able to show us some ways to actually put it into practice. He pulls a lot of his work from Frantz Fanon, right? And after doing this episode, actually last year, late last year, after doing this episode with him, he sort of reignited this passion for me to look back up on Frantz Fanon's work, right? And I started rereading some of Frantz Fanon's work, and how Frantz Fanon was not just a social theorist, right? How he also was a practicing clinician, and Daniel does a great job of highlighting that in his writings, right? One other thing that I think Daniel did for me, I think personally, while having this conversation with him, right, he brought up some of the influences of folks in, outside of our Western world, right? And specifically a nation outside of the Western world, right? So he mentioned some Brazilians and some folks from Latin America that also played a role in writing decolonizing psychoanalytic techniques, right? And one person he mentioned in particular was Juliano Moreira, right, who was a Brazilian, Afro-Brazilian clinician from the early 1900s, right? That he was able to sort of become and connect, was able to connect with Freud and some of that, and just to kind of see how early folks of color and clinicians were doing this work that we're doing now, and he's able to sort of name that, and he also named other folks, right? And from there, I have been personally on my own journey of looking at different folks in Latin America and across the world who can really inspire and expand my mind, right? And his work really tend to amplify that, right? We had a little bit of technical difficulties in the middle of the episode. You're gonna notice there's a bit of a quick sort of pause in the episode, but we're able to sort of jump right back in. But there is this little bit of a rupture you will notice in the episode, but the conversation will continue, and he's able to sort of come back and bring back the concept how to engage in with the patient. He does a brilliant job of creating this axis, right, of how we kind of see ourselves in different spaces, a hierarchy of where we stand in our positionality, and also our ability to connect and not like sort of attachment based experiences, right? And how that kind of all comes from a social aspect. And he does a great job of highlighting that. I'm gonna say a little bit more about Daniel. So Daniel is a clinical psychologist and a professor of psychology at Queens College. He is the director of Frantz Fanon Lab for Decolonial Psychology, where he conducts research on Puerto Rican Latinx population, ethnic minority identities, psychotherapy, and public policy, and the social determination of health. He's the author again of A People History of Psychoanalytic Theory, from Freud to Liberation Psychology, and Decolonizing Psychoanalytic Technique, putting Freud on Fanon's couch. He received his doctorate from Rutgers University, and where he focused on multicultural psychology, anxiety, and trauma. He's originally from Puerto Rico and currently resides in New York City. And I know you guys would really, really enjoy this episode. It was one of my favorite episodes, and I would love to even have him back soon because I really enjoyed talking to him. My name is Lima, and I'm your host on House of Therapy podcast. And today I'm with Daniel Jose Gaztambide, Josue is my dad's name. Here you go. Dr. Daniel Jose Gaztambide. Butcher your name. Can you pronounce it for me? I told you I was going to do this.
No problem, man. I mean, imagine anytime I'm on the phone with like my internet service and I have to spell out the whole name every time. Mm-hmm. So I'm Daniel Jose Gaztambide, Gaztambide.
Uh-huh. So tell me a little bit about yourself.
A little bit about myself. So I am a assistant professor of psychology in the Department of Psychology at Queens College, where I also direct the Frantz Fanon Lab for Decolonial Psychology. I'm also an analytic candidate at the NYU postdoctoral program in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. Mm-hmm. And I am the author of A People's History of Psychoanalysis, from Freud to Liberation Psychology, and the recent Decolonizing Psychoanalytic Technique, putting Freud on Fanon's couch.
Yeah, I don't know how I came across your book. I came across your book through like a email and sort of that you sent out, and I saw the title, right, putting Freud on Fanon's couch, and I was like, that sounds really interesting. I looked through your page. Tell me a little bit about that, but also, I guess, even before getting there, tell me a bit about how you got to this space, right? To the psychoanalytic space, what led you to sort of becoming a therapist, a professor in Queens, and all of that, right? I lived in Jackson Heights for a bit, so.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Very cool. I guess my journey to psychoanalysis in Queens College. So I'm originally from San Juan, Puerto Rico, and something that I often like to say when I'm asked this type of question is that in order to understand the context of my developmental journey, we must go back to my mother, as we must all do go back to the mother. Because it just so happened that my mom was a secretary for our church, where a lot of the pastors were either psychologically trained or were getting their doctorates in clinical psychology.
Oh, wow.
So there was a lot of exposure growing up to psychology as a pastoral practice, as well as something that was kind of embedded in the health of the community. So it always just seemed organic and natural to think of psychoanalysis and psychology as something that's understood in the context of community. And so my mom would read all sorts of books that she would, read or share with me, which would make for, some interesting bedtime stories. And it's weird. Like most kids, they, when they're little, they think, oh, I want to be an astronaut. I want to be a firefighter. I want to be a cowboy. And I was like, I want to be a psychoanalyst. Like the weirdest fucking Puerto Rican kid you could imagine wanting to be a psychoanalyst at like age 5. So, so I just kind of grew up with that stuff in the environment, right? And was always curious about not just how people work, like what is that made people tick, but also noticing all of the kind of tacit, unnamed things that were around us all the time, right? So growing up in Puerto Rico, it was like, sort of an unthought known. the fact that we're in this colonial situation with the United States, the fact that there's this rampant income inequality, the fact that there's different forms of colorism and mestizaje taking place in their families. Like all this stuff was sort of in the ether for me. And it was just curious how present it was, but how it was not talked about, right? Sort of forming part of what we might call our social unconscious, like all of those things that are part of our everyday reality. It's all around us, but we either choose not to talk about, or we are kind of guided away from really talking about and sort of operating outside of our awareness. So it was always just kind of a part of me. Then I was, getting ready to go to college, and I remember I was originally going to go to Syracuse because they just happened to do a open house in San Juan, and they showed this cute little video of all these happy Puerto Rican kids living out in Syracuse. And I was like, oh, they seem like they're having a good time. Maybe I'll go to Syracuse. And then my goddad, who was he was the chair of the Puerto Rican and Caribbean Studies Department at the time at Rutgers University, and he was just not having it. He's like, you're not gonna go to our like football enemies school. You're gonna come to Rutgers. So I wound up at Rutgers. I did my undergrad there. Had a major just culture shock, just acculturating to living in the States and being in this whole other world. But it was my first experience living outside of the island, and so living outside of Puerto Rico gave me like a different perspective on the kind of things I grew up with and I saw, alongside the things that I was experiencing here in the States in terms of migrating, acculturating, dealing with different types of racism and colorism, essentially. Where like in Puerto Rico, being a white Puerto Rican, being a blanquito, there was always all these different types of privileges and deferral and envy and anxiety around what my physique looked like and meant to people. And then coming to the States and suddenly being treated as this kind of always aggressive, always dangerous, sort of near rapacious, right, ethnic, racial other. And so moving in between those two spaces of the ways in which my body would be read and how I'd be construed to people, to police officers, etc., just really got me to double down even more, wanting to understand what is it that drives all the inequality that we see, the racism, the sexism, the queerphobia, what keeps this whole apparatus together. And it was through those interests that I wound up at Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York, which was a hotbed of liberation psychology. That's where I got exposed to the work of Ignacio Martín Baró and Paulo Freire, and had my first, I want to say, brush with the work of Frantz Fanon. But in many respects, my experience at Union is emblematic of what I would go on to sort of address later in my career, which is that at Union, you had on the one hand all the like social justice, liberation psychology, decolonial folks. And then on the other hand, you had all the psychoanalytic psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers. And there was always just this beef, like, do you center the role of the social context and societal oppression, or do you really just center like individual psychology, right? The texture of your own intrapsychic experience and so forth. And so it just felt like a very odd bifurcation because, again, growing up, my experience was of both, right? That, yes, of course, there's like individual subjectivity, but it's never in isolation. It's always in the context of not just interpersonal relationships, which are, of course, important, but also community, right? Social context. Whether you, for example, have the right to vote for president of the country that owns your homeland or not, right? So all these things matter. And so Union was kind of the place where I really started to think about how to suture these different things together. Like, what does a psychoanalytic approach to thinking about the social, not just theoretically, but in terms of its implications for clinical practice and for policy? So at Union, all these kind of concerns are kind of born for me, or to very least sharpen. From Union, I went back to Rutgers because I
Mm-hmm.
hadn't had enough of the old banks of the Raritan, so I went back to Rutgers to do my
Mm-hmm.
doctorate at the Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology, which provided a really wonderful space by a very diverse group of faculty members who were very game for the kind of project I was developing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, did my doctorate at Rutgers, got my degree, did my internship at what was at the time St. Luke's Hospital, then Mount Sinai. From Mount Sinai, I got my first academic job at the New School for Social Research, where I was there for
Mm-hmm.
about 5 years as assistant professor, then assistant director of clinical training. And I did a lot of, sort of research, supervision of graduate students, and of course, getting my first book out, and then more recently, my second book, as I transitioned to now my current position at Queens College on a tenure track faculty appointment.
Oh, nice.
So
Congrats.
still working on, thank you. So still
Mm-hmm.
working on all these issues, both from a scholarly perspective as well as a data-driven perspective, conducting actual research to answer
Mm-hmm.
some of these questions. So that's the sort of long, circuitous line
No,
to
no,
how it is
that's
we're at here today.
a good answer. I'm a little bit interested. Like, I guess it's like little curiosity in me. It's like, huh, I've, I, the bit that I know about the Puerto Rican community, there is just this, I guess, especially in the island, very like Christian background, evangelical background that's there, and I
Yeah.
just never connected the two with like psychoanalytic practice, right? And folks being sort of from that background, which is it's a good thing, right? I also like I didn't notice that I had the pedagogy of the oppressed behind me as well, like
Oh
right,
yeah.
and the
Oh, yeah, I see that
liberation,
behind you.
and the
And
liberation,
writings for liberation
liberation.
psychology.
I
I
did
see it.
not
I
plan.
recognize the purple.
Yeah, I did not plan for it. I I um I grabbed it the other day, and I was looking through it, and I put it up there. Just, but
Oh, what an interesting synchronicity then.
yeah, 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 for sure.
That's so funny.
Um, but that work, right, of I guess even just jumping into your first book, talking about like liberation psychology and some of that, how did you sort of like tie that in? Because the I guess the title of the book is psychoanalytic or psychoanalysis I don't have it from the top of my mind here, but to
Oh, you mean
liberation
from
psychology.
Freud to liberation psychology?
Psychology, from Freud's liberation psychology. How did you sort
Yeah.
of quickly sort of like were you able to sort of I guess create that story?
Well, it's interesting, right? Because again, my graduate school training from my master's to my doctorate was essentially that these things are in tension, right?
Yeah.
Freud represents a kind of Western, Eurocentric kind of episteme that is hostile, dismissive towards social justice issues, the concerns of people, the global South, etc. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of an interesting narrative that I noticed was fed into both by more conservative psychoanalysts as
Mm-hmm.
well as by different kind of multicultural psychologists and thinkers, where it almost seemed like the more conservative psychoanalysts were saying, people of color, the poor, LGBT people, we just don't have the stuff
Mm-hmm.
to be able to do psychoanalysis. We don't have enough ego strength, or
Yeah.
we want quick fixes or whatever. And then you'll have certain kinds of multicultural scholars saying, yeah, psychoanalysis is no good for us because we are presently oriented and looking for quick fix and blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just strange to see that both sides of this debate were taking such a narrow view, not just of psychoanalysis, but just such a narrow view of communities of the global South.
Mm-hmm.
As if, and this is what I get into in the book, as if throughout the global South, not only do you have varieties of different emancipatory liberationist movements that
Mm-hmm.
say, on the one hand, drew on Marx for their decolonial liberationist projects, but that also drew on Freud.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some sort of contradiction here. How is it that you have thinkers like Frantz Fanon,
Mm-hmm.
who was not only a revolutionary thinker and literally a revolutionary, but also a practicing psychoanalytic therapist,
Yeah.
right? How do you make sense of that, given the way we talk about these things? But then on the other hand, it was also discovering Elizabeth Danto's now classic book, Freud's Free Clinics, Psychoanalysis and Social Justice, 1918 to 1938, which just tells such a different story about what the early psychoanalysts were up to, right? The fact that many, if not most of them, were communists, socialists, Marxists, with Freud being the most conservative as a social democrat, which in U.S. politics is more to the left than anything in U.S. politics. So knowing that, coupled with the fact that for many of these people, they were also predominantly Jewish men and women in turn of century Europe around the time of like systematic anti-Semitism and the rise of the Nazi Party, right? So there was something about the left-wing commitments of this group of people, coupled with some of the imperfect, complicated, and fraught ways that they negotiated their own marginality within their society. So it sort of took me from just, just having a kind of narrow view of Freud to having a perspective where I'm obviously able to critique the obvious blind spots that he had, while also recognizing that he had those blind spots for a reason. So part of what that first book was working through is, number one, the fact that not only does psychoanalysis have this kind of leftist progressive history, but also, two, that there were people across the global south who were drawing on psychoanalysis to inform their emancipatory projects. But then also, three, that maybe that history helps articulate a theory, not only of oppression writ large, but of what happened to psychoanalysis itself. In other words, what happens when you have a group of people who were living in absolute segregation and ghettoification for years and are then given sort of a certain set of rights within a liberal regime, and how that liberal regime says, oh yeah, we'll let you enter our society, but only on our terms. So you have to be like us if you want to integrate and assimilate into the broader society, right? So like taking that into account helps explain, well, not only was Freud and the early psychoanalysts marginal people because of their Jewishness at the time, but that they engaged in these negotiations where they wind up internalizing a lot of the logic of the surrounding system. So that leads psychoanalysis to both have a critique of very rigid gender norms and patriarchy, and at the same time to also enact patriarchal and sexist scripts. The early psychoanalysts have a very interesting theory of how we can think about racism as a tool of divide and conquer that helps explain the allure of anti-Semitism and anti-Blackness in the United States and Europe. Very rich theory that parallels some of the best work of Fanon, who was also informed by this theory, but also Du Bois, who predicted this theory even before Freud thought about it. But yet at the same time, Freud and the early psychoanalysts also enacted racist colonialist scripts. So it's understanding that there's both of these things at play in early psychoanalysis, but that you have generation after generation of people of the global south who pick up psychoanalysis, warts and all, and wind up reimagining it in a way that does, sort of does good on the promise of its emancipatory potential, both at the individual level and the collective level as well.
No, yeah, thank you for sharing that. I'm trying to remember the reason why I like throughout the years I became really drawn to like even like because I'm Brazilian, to the Brazilian history around like psychoanalysis and like and in the global South, right? So like South America specifically, of course, like initially like Argentina comes up, right? All the stuff around Argentina and psychoanalysis around Argentina and this and that. And then I was like, wait, I'm sure Brazil's a huge country. I'm sure we have all of this stuff as well, right? And throughout the years, I've learned around a lot about my own background and psychoanalysis and my own culture, right? And how it has been around for decades, right? In Brazil specifically. There's like this psychoanalyst. She's like over 100. She's like 101 years old. She's still like
101.
Yeah, she I have a supervisor also in Brazil, a psychoanalytic supervisor in Brazil that sort of informs me of all sort of the stuff that's like being written in Brazil and some of the stuff that's there, which is it's just a lot different than what we also see in the U.S. and some of
Right.
the spaces. So and also like the belief that people like myself and yourself and right that we can hold a lot of this stuff, that we're able to think about things, process things, and it's sort of, I think, like I was thought to be a critical thinker my whole life, right? So to be
Hmm.
able to do that in my practice, and also folks of color, we're consciously aware of that. We're constantly critically thinking. We're aware of different things and different dynamics, right? And we're processing things in our own ways. And throughout the years, I always found myself just like kind of practice psychodynamically because of that, of how complex we are as individuals, even given like
Yeah.
our mixed backgrounds and some of that in general, right? Um, I love the idea of the book, right, and also given our Latin American background, right, and also like our, again, Brazil has gone through a lot of progressive moments in its past, right,
Hmm.
and understanding how some of that also played a role in it as well. Um, the I guess jumping into your newer book, right, putting Freud on the couch. Say a little bit more about that.
So the second book, Decolonizing Psychoanalytic Technique, is very much it's a sequel and a response to the first book.
Hmm.
So the first book, I put it out into the world. Um, I knew I had something special at hand, but I didn't really, it didn't really click until, I start getting invitations to start going out and doing a lot of talks on the book, and just noticing how many, students and graduate students had been picking up the book.
Hmm.
And I was really moved by that, because
Yeah.
that first book and the second one too, were books that I wrote for myself in training. You know what I mean? Like, there were
Hmm.
things I feel that I had gotten when I was in school doing clinical
Hmm.
training, and so I was trying to kind of provide that. So first providing the idea that there is a history here of people of color in psychoanalysis
Hmm.
going back to the beginning of the field,
Hmm.
and that's a story that needs to be told to provide people like us context.
Hmm.
However, when I was presenting and doing case conferences and things like that, I kept getting the following rejoinder over and over again, which is, this is great, like, oh, this is amazing, but what does this mean for my clinical practice?
Hmm.
How do I take this history and make it something concrete that actually impacts how I work with patients? And that's the part that I found people were most hungry for. So,
Hmm.
not just talking in a kind of generic way that culture is important, we need to have cultural competence, or we need to, think about social justice. We needed something that went beyond just a moral call to
Hmm.
considering these issues, to something that really spoke to, what is your theory of mind?
Hmm.
How does that theory of mind inform your clinical practice with your patients? And how do you do that from a psychoanalytic point of view that's also attuned to these issues, whether you call it a social or a decolonial psychoanalysis?
Hmm.
So I thought about that a lot, and I was like, oh, gee, I guess I noticed that problem in my own practice. So I was reflecting about my own training,
Hmm.
and I noticed that, we have kind of a weird thing going on in school, whether it's clinical psychology school, psychiatry, medical
Hmm.
school, social work school. And that is that we're often expected to learn something called the basics, right? So
Hmm.
you take your systems of psychotherapy course, or your
Yeah.
intro to counseling, or your basics fundamentals of psychodynamic therapy, or
Hmm.
fundamentals of cognitive behavioral therapy, right?
Hmm.
Whatever it may be, you learn this thing called the basics, and then a year or two later you take this other course on
Hmm.
diversity, on cultural competence, right? And the two are like totally separate universes,
Yeah.
because the one gives you a particular model of, say, child development, a
Hmm.
particular model of the human mind and how it works, what leads us to fall ill, right?
Hmm.
And sometimes that would be like totally bifurcated from this other conversation we're supposed to have around what is the role of the social context in mental health? How do you work with that clinically?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So noticing that, it's like, oh, gee, like there really is a bifurcation, not just in how I was trained, but how many of us was trained. And I would start going to conferences with this in mind, and I would start to hear it. Like I remember very clearly a debate that took place between two progressive kind of psychoanalytic clinicians, right? Both cared very much about social justice, both talked about how they address issues of identity with patients. But when it came to the pragmatics of how do you do it, it was radically different.
Yeah.
One clinician said, well, you have to bring it up at the beginning of the session. It's the first thing you got to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Got to talk about race, gender, sexuality, class. And then the other therapist said, well, no, why would I do that? That would be imposing on the patient an
Mm-hmm.
expectation about their identity that they may or may not have. So
Mm-hmm.
I'll wait for the patient to bring it up.
Mm-hmm.
And that debate was emblematic of what it is we see in clinical practice.
Mm-hmm.
People get stuck with this anxiety. Do I wait for the patient to bring up race, gender, sexuality, and class?
Mm-hmm.
Or do I take the initiative and broach those subjects, maybe to invite it for the patient, to let them know that it's safe for them to talk about these things?
Mm-hmm.
It's essentially a debate between what we might call today cultural humility, the idea of
Mm-hmm.
making space for the patient to talk about identity on their own terms,
Mm-hmm.
with you as the therapist just sort of being receptive to them, versus broaching, which really emphasizes, no, you as the therapist have the responsibility to bring these
Mm-hmm.
things up. So now I'm seeing this bifurcation between learning the basics of therapy and learning cultural, quote unquote, cultural competence. And then also this bifurcation between, do you, the therapist, bring it up? Does the patient bring it up?
Mm-hmm.
And looking at that, I realized, we really don't have an integrated model for how to do these things
Mm-hmm.
in ways that can guide in actual clinical practice how you make these choices. Because that's what they are. They're clinical choices. Well, how do you decide with whom you sort of take your time waiting for things to bubble up? With whom is it really imperative that you do try to broach these issues? So, okay, we need some kind of model. Well, how is it that we're trying to develop our models of psychotherapy from a decolonial or social cultural point of view? And there I notice kind of the third problem of bifurcation, which is that we all start from some given model and then we stretch it.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are psychoanalytic, but you are relational, you start with the foundations of a relational model and you just stretch it. What are the foundations of a relational model? We're born and created in a matrix of relationships.
Mm-hmm.
What's culture? Another matrix of relationships, right? Or if you are contemporary Freudian, you might say, okay, I have this theory of mind organized around ego defenses and the unconscious. I'm just going to stretch that to include issues of the social.
Mm-hmm.
And this is all well and good, but I noticed that even though we stretch the models to adapt them to, say, issues of culture, that never translates back into the model.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, the model doesn't change. We're not reimagining the foundations
Yeah.
of the model in a way that includes these things from jump, right? The metaphor I would use is almost like you have this pre-built house called psychoanalysis, called CBT, called family systems. And then you're just going to build a garage next to it, and that's where we're going to put all the social stuff.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to saying, well, gee, maybe we really do need new foundations for a new house that has built within its very structure how to think about these things in a systematic, theory grounded, and evidence informed way. Okay, so that's essentially the prologue. That's the plot of what it is I'm trying to do with decolonizing psychoanalytic technique. What if we revisit the very foundations of how we work and rethink our model of the mind and our model of clinical technique so that it becomes something organic? We're organically thinking, for reasons I can get into later, we're organically thinking simultaneously about people's relational experience and their social cultural world in a way that is integrated and that is always already there in the consulting room. You don't have to do a hocus pocus to summon the social world. The social world is already there. We just need a mode of technique to be able to facilitate talking about it with our patients. I could say more, but let me just pause there and see how that
Yeah,
lands with you.
can I ask you in a, I guess, in a way, in a detailed way of how do we sort of how would we do that with our patients, right? I know, I guess for me and myself, it's sort of always sort of this dance that kind of, it depends on the patient
Yeah,
and the time and this
yeah,
and this, right? So I probably fall under the second individual, right? I know individuals like you mentioned, who will start off the like the first session when they meet the patient, right? I'm Sosnas. I was born here, and this is my background, and
right,
and run the whole list, right? And I understand that whole concept, right?
right.
I always find that who I am as a person will always show up in that space, right? My
Yeah,
my brownness will show up in that space. All of these stuff eventually will show up, even if I don't like, even if I don't say, if I ever never sort of wanted to bring it up, it's gonna come up in some way somehow. Um,
yeah.
and again, all of that other stuff. Um, how would, I guess, in a detailed way, um I guess from your point of view, how would that kind of sort of already present in the room, how do you kind of start naming it, how is that's kind of named per se?
Yeah, so I'll tell you a little bit about the method of how I got there, and then I'll
Hmm.
tell you about the there itself. So,
Okay.
the way that I started to try to answer this question methodologically was by recognizing two things. In the same way that we have these different bifurcations I mentioned before in kind of our models and our theory, we see these bifurcations
Hmm.
both in how we read Freud and how we read Fanon. So when we read Freud, typically we have the theory of mind and then we have a clinical technique. But we completely dissociate that he has a whole other body of work that
Hmm.
he gets into thinking about the social. So
Hmm.
thinking about how do we understand gender as something that's made, not just born?
Hmm.
Or how do we understand race as something that is kind of socially constructed and
Hmm.
serves a psychological function, right? So he has this whole body of work that we don't really teach or talk about in clinical training. So the first step was, wait a minute, what happens if I connect his way of approaching the social with his theory of mind and his
Yeah.
clinical technique? And when I did that, it turns out that there are some apocryphal cases, so cases that he didn't write about,
Hmm.
but the patients wrote about. So the patients
Hmm.
snitch on him.
Hmm.
And the patients talk about some very interesting ways that he addressed race and culture and sexuality in psychotherapy. And I go, oh, that's interesting. There's a way of doing this that actually ties back to the model. And then I do the same thing for Sander Ferenczi, who's kind of the founder of relational interpersonal thinking. And I do the same for Jacques Lacan, who's, of
Hmm.
course, one of the most widely read theorists across the world, certainly in the global south.
Hmm.
Then I look at Fanon and I realize, gee, we often talk about him only as a social
Social.
theorist.
Hmm.
We don't notice he was also a practitioner.
I
So
didn't
I
know
do the
for a
same thing with
while, just to
Fanon.
let you know. I didn't
Right.
know for a
No,
while.
me neither.
Yeah.
Me neither, man. Like I sort of nominally
Yeah.
knew he was a psychiatrist,
Yeah.
but as far as anybody talked about him, he was a psychiatrist for like 5 minutes, and
Uh-huh.
then he went to go fight the Algerian Revolution.
Yeah.
But it was discovering that he had a lot of clinical writing,
Hmm.
and there were people who trained with him and were trained by him who wrote about his clinical work. And
Hmm.
surprise, it's resoundingly psychoanalytic.
Hmm.
So I'm basically doing what I did with Freud, but in reverse for Fanon. I'm taking his social theory, connecting it to his clinical practice, and
Hmm.
connecting that with the theory of mind. That gives me what I call a Mobius circuit. It's a kind of a script moving from the inside of the psychoanalytic canon, Freud, Ferenczi, Lacan, all the way to the outside with Fanon, and then back in.
Hmm.
So it's creating again this new house, this new foundation that includes relational and includes Lacanian, but
Hmm.
it's doing so within a house that is decolonial and Fanonian in nature.
Hmm.
So doing all of that, going back to your original question, well, what does that get me concretely? Let me answer that in the most like basic, concrete way possible. And I'm going to draw on a little bit of the research that's in the book, the empirical research that actually supports these ideas. So if you have a theory of mind that is constituted by its interpersonal relationships, early mother-infant interactions with parents, with attachment figures, whatever, if that's how you see the mind, as essentially about two people, which then translates into psychotherapy, there's about two people in a room, then you're going to struggle to address the kind of things we're talking about. Because it's a two-person model, there's only two choices. Either you bring it up or the patient brings it up. If they bring it up, it's okay to talk about. If you bring it up, what if it's an imposition? You get stuck in this, what I call dyadic logic. You get stuck, and it makes it really hard to get into this stuff. Well, what if you had a totally different model of the mind? Let's start from the premise that the human mind, the human brain, what we might call the unconscious, operates with two primary concerns. One of those concerns is to manage the overall level of excitation, of arousal in the body, number one. And then number two, it's very concerned with that body's positionality in space. To make this more concrete, you have a lot of research that suggests that our capacity for language and our capacity to navigate social space evolved out of specific circuitry that is concerned with the body in physical space. So think very concretely about if you see a delicious a slice of cheesecake or flan or tres leche, whatever floats your boat, and you have a hankering, right? You're going to physically approach the delicious dessert. You're going to devour it. If you walking down the street and you see maybe something stinky on the ground, you're going to go, ooh, you're going to try to avoid it. You're going to try to go around it. You're going to pull away from it. Similarly, if you think concretely about, you have to reach your creamer and it's on the top shelf, you have to physically reach up to the top in order to pull it back down, right? There are all these mechanics involved in how we move our body in space. Well, it turns out the brain, and I would argue the unconscious, borrows from those same circuits to talk about social space on two very important quadrants. A horizontal quadrant of affiliation and closeness, right? So how do you approach people that you want to get close to? How and when do you pull away from people? When you feel threatened, when you don't feel safe, right? So it's this literal mechanism of approach and withdrawal. But there's this other system that is much more vertically organized. It's hierarchically structured. And that has to do a little bit less with how do I find intimacy? How do I get close with people? And it's a little bit more about what is my position within this hierarchy? How do I navigate where I am in that position in the hierarchy within my broader community? So whereas the first system is very much interpersonally oriented, how do I get close to people? How do I find intimacy in relationships? Attachment in its essence. This other social cognitive system is very much organized around status, around rank, around not who I am in the eyes of my beloved, but who am I in the eyes of the community? How am I seen by others? Am I somewhere above because I am treasured, I have prestige, or am I somewhere below where I am deprived, I am devalued? Or am I anxiously in the middle somewhere trying to climb up, but also making sure I don't fall down? Both of these things, I argue in the book, through Freud, Ferenczi, Lacan, and Fanon, with a little help from contemporary research, I argue that these are two foundational motivating factors in human psychology. And in turn, these are two fundamental areas around which we can develop defenses, compromise formations, patterns of relating in order to protect ourselves and, again, keep the overall level of arousal within some manageable constraints, right? So I'm figuring out, well, how do I find love? How do I find intimacy? How do I protect myself?
I guess I would like to probably recap a little bit of
Mm.
even because you started going into like the clinical implications of it, right?
Yeah,
You started talking about the axis and like how to kind of identify that in the room with the patient. Probably start recapping that and just, I guess, expanding on the clinical implications of it. Um, I have a curiosity on my own, right? And I can
sure.
ask you about it. It's around like Fanon's work. So I again like it's probably it's been a year or so that I found out that he also was a practicing clinician, right?
Right, right, right,
Um,
right.
I read him in graduate school, right? We had like read like snippets of him in graduate school, and I had an idea, like a peripherally idea of who Fanon was, right? And I when we read Ratchet of the Earth, I believe the book,
Hmm.
right? And like thought he was brilliant, right? Especially how he viewed decolonization and some of that kind of stuff. And then recently, like in the past year, I became aware, like, wait, he's a clinician as well. Because again, like reading his book, and it's like, wait, he's a psychiatrist. Like, but like psychiatrists back in like in the 40s and 30s, they were trained very differently than they are now. So I
Hmm.
wonder, so like that thought in my mind, like, I wonder if he practiced. Um, but like recently I found out that he practiced, and then like your work really sort of like really like elevates that whole part out. I
Yeah.
mean, if you're willing to sort of talk a bit about that and I guess like shed some light around that. And I know you have a lab called was it called like the
Oh, the Frantz Fanon Lab for
yeah,
Decolonial Psychology. Yeah.
yeah. So maybe to talk about that a little bit. How does that sound?
That sounds great. So do you want to just jump in right here, or do you want to, start with the other stuff?
We can start wherever you want to start. So you want to jump in right here?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a great starting point actually. Because Fanon really helped me integrate a lot of stuff that I saw in Freud and Ferenczi and Lacan that ultimately led to the model I put forth in the book. So, very much like you, my experience of Fanon initially was, reading Black Skin, White Mass and The Wretched of the Earth. Those are like the two things
Mm-hmm.
anybody who knows about Fanon usually reads.
Mm-hmm.
But when they read it, they read him kind of narrowly as a revolutionary theorist, as a
Yeah.
political theorist, as a philosopher of
Mm-hmm.
liberation, we might say. But like people miss the plot when he says at the beginning of Black Skin, White Masks, this is a psychoanalytic study. It
Yeah.
is a clinical study. He's citing Anna and Sigmund Freud and Adler and Jung and all these people. Like it's
Mm-hmm.
practically dripping in psychoanalytic theory and in the use of a psychoanalytic clinical logic to understand how oppression becomes internalized, right? And then in Wretched of the Earth, right, it's mostly very, you could say, political, but then out of nowhere, he has an entire chapter about his clinical work under
Mm-hmm.
conditions of colonization and war. And
Yeah.
he himself says, it might seem a little weird to have a psychiatric, psychotherapeutic chapter in the middle of talking about all this political stuff, but it's actually quite relevant.
Mm-hmm.
So, in some ways, like the clinical Fanon has always been there.
Yeah.
We're usually just trained to think about him more as a philosopher than a clinician. For me, where it really started to pop was probably, I mean, like I knew he was a psychiatrist, and I sort of
Mm-hmm.
like sensed that he was a psychoanalytically oriented psychiatrist. But probably the first hint that there was more to the story was reading Alice Cherky's biography of Fanon, which I think is called Frantz Fanon, A Portrait. So she is a Lacanian psychoanalyst, I believe also a psychiatrist, who actually did her residency under Fanon. So
Oh,
she was
nice.
supervised by him clinically. She trained with
Mm-hmm.
him. And she talks in the book about how Fanon had them read like classic psychoanalytic texts.
Yeah.
So he had them read about transference and countertransference. He was also very much, she tells us, very infatuated with
Mm-hmm.
Shandor Ferenczi's work and his more relational interpersonal model. And she says that he was always on the lookout for translations of his work so that he could read it.
Yeah.
So very much versed in a kind of relational model while
Mm-hmm.
also drawing on a Lacanian model as well. And he was just kind of training his residents, right, on how to
Yeah.
practice and think psychoanalytically. So that book was the first one that really started to showcase Fanon as a clinician.
Yeah.
The second turn for me was the, massive volume, Alienation and Freedom, which collects not
Mm-hmm.
just all of these previously untranslated political texts, but also a lot of his clinical papers.
Mm-hmm.
So it was really between reading Alice Cherky's work and his clinical papers that I started to realize, like, oh no, he saw patients.
Yeah.
He really practiced while also adapting psychoanalysis to these colonial conditions in a decolonial frame. But the moment that really kind of nailed it for me, I
Mm-hmm.
was in a seminar with a lot of other kind of radical, liberation oriented thinkers, and I was the
Mm-hmm.
only clinician in the group, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when I presented my work reading Freud and Fanon, they were aghast. Like, how
Mm-hmm.
could you read Fanon in the same breath as Freud? How is that possible?
Mm-hmm.
And one of my colleagues in the seminar, who I, very much respect, he's a really great scholar. His response was, Fanon didn't use the couch. What are you talking about? Their thinking was that at best, he was basically a political theorist. And if he
Mm-hmm.
did any clinical stuff, it was group therapy and it was institutional psychotherapy,
Yeah.
which is true. Like he was very much involved in creating institutional and structural change at
Mm-hmm.
the various clinics that he worked in. So that's true. But their sentiment was he didn't do any individual psychotherapy, let alone individual psycholytic therapy.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't use the couch. It was after that seminar that I found Marie-Jeanne Monolon's Je suis le dicté de Fanon. She was basically a social worker
Mm-hmm.
who was also clinically supervised by Fanon and who literally followed him on his
Oh wow.
grounds and took notes, very detailed notes on his consultations in the psychiatric unit.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a little unorthodox, and she was literally in the
Room.
room when he was with his patients
Mm-hmm.
doing psychoanalysis 5 to 6 times a week
Mm-hmm.
using the literal couch.
Yeah.
She made it
Yeah.
very clear that her
Mm-hmm.
job was to write down in detail what was spoken from the couch, meaning the voice of the patient,
Mm-hmm.
and what was spoken from the man sitting behind the couch, which of
Mm-hmm.
course was Fanon. So when I read that book and all that incredible detail about his clinical thinking and the patients he worked with and the way that he supervised, I was just like, this is a done deal. The man was a
Yeah.
psychoanalytic therapist.
Yeah.
He drew on it in his clinical work and he drew on it in his political thinking as well. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's one of the things I'm most proud of in decolonizing psychoanalytic technique is shedding light on how he actually practiced
Yeah.
and what we can learn from his practice for clinical work today.
Mm-hmm. That's huge. I might have to kind of Google those names, right, and look up those books as you mentioned them. It's such a it's interesting because a part of it, it sounds like a rich work, right? That like every clinician needs to sort of be aware of. Okay, this is
Yeah.
like Fanon's, and especially him being a man of color, being a black man, and right, and to have that in our history of tradition of practicing psychotherapy, it's huge to have that to be able to go, okay, he's also one of the fathers, and to be able to name that as
Yes,
well. Yeah.
100%. And he's probably like, I focused on him because he really distills all of the threads of what I call a decolonial psychoanalysis. So to
Mm-hmm.
be clear, there were people even before Fanon in
Mm-hmm.
1952, by the way,
Yeah.
who formed this decolonial tradition. So going all the way back to Freud, right?
Mm-hmm.
So uh Freud starts doing his initial work in like the late 1800s, and one of the first people to read it and propagate it worldwide
Mm-hmm.
was a man by the name of Juliano Moreira, who
Mm-hmm.
was one of the first Afro-Brazilian
Mm-hmm.
psychiatrists
Mm-hmm.
in Brazil, who
Mm-hmm.
did a fellowship
Mm-hmm.
in Europe, traveling around Germany and all those places. And he was one of the first people to teach
Mm-hmm.
Freud in medical schools. and to not
Mm-hmm.
only teach Freud, but to adapt Freud to his conditions, which was also related to
Mm-hmm.
dealing with anti-Blackness in
Yeah.
Brazil, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he was one of the first worldwide. And then there were others who actually exchanged letters with Freud, like Grindasi Carbose in India, who was one of the
Mm-hmm.
people to found the Indian Psychoanalytic Society. You also had Heisaku Kosawa, who was
Mm-hmm.
a Japanese, I believe, Japanese doctor who actually
Mm-hmm.
went to Vienna and trained with Freud
Oh wow.
and then brought it back to Japan. But he also
Mm-hmm.
adapted it in a very relational way.
Mm-hmm.
There was also Margaret Morgan Lawrence, who was one of the first Black women graduates of the Columbia Psychoanalytic Institute
Mm-hmm.
and is in many ways the mother of community psychoanalysis. So there
Mm-hmm.
were all of these people before Fanon,
Yeah.
but they all had different threads of the work. So some of them, like Grindasika Bose, did more of the kind of cultural critique of Freud. So he
Mm-hmm.
critiqued the kind of Eurocentric nature of Freud's theories, but he wasn't necessarily like a very political person himself, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then you have others in the tradition who were more interested in kind of political critiques, right, of like capitalism, racism,
Mm-hmm.
but may or may not themselves have been clinicians. So you have all these different people who
Mm-hmm.
touch on either the clinical dimension or the more political dimension. And I center Fanon because he kind of brings both of those together. So it's
Mm-hmm.
not just a cultural critique of Freud, right? It's a cultural critique that goes in hand with a political ethics, that
Mm-hmm.
there's ways in which we come into the room where it is important to be attentive to these issues as they come through in the patient's speech and their
Mm-hmm.
behavior. But he would also advocate for a kind of uh, almost political therapeutics outside of the encounter with the patient. In other words, how do we as clinicians take seriously the suffering that our patients are undergoing
Mm-hmm.
and connect that suffering not just to their developmental history, but also to the broader world that we inhabit? Mayhaps are there ways we can consider as clinicians how we need to get politically involved in order
Mm-hmm.
to create a more just and healthier world? So it's not to say that Fanon was necessarily the only one or even the
Mm-hmm.
first, because I do talk about all these other people in the book, but he, I think, provides the most cohesive body of work that we can actually read and
Mm-hmm.
put together with his political work. So it's a way of synthesizing both the clinical and the political simultaneously.
Mm-hmm. I love that, and I'm interested even reading about the Brazilian division, the Moreira. I was like that name sounds very
Yeah.
Portuguese, Brazilian. Um, and what like to look at Fanon as a clinician, right?
Mhm.
And through that lens, what are some like clinical implications that he did like I guess bring to us?
That's an excellent question. So, because he integrates both Ferenczi, meaning he integrates a relational interpersonal approach
Mm-hmm.
with a Lacanian approach, which is, for folks who are not aware,
Mm-hmm.
Lacan essentially broke with the analytic establishment in the 50s because it was becoming a little too focused, not a little too focused, but quite focused on
Mm-hmm.
adapting the patient to their social conditions
Mm-hmm.
without necessarily critiquing and questioning those social conditions and
Mm-hmm.
how they impact the patient. So to make it very simply, I'm going to summarize in sort of a reductive way in the interest of time.
Mm-hmm.
Lacan was very interested in how when the patient speaks, they're not just articulating their familial drama, they're
Mm-hmm.
also speaking a language that reflects a broader political world that includes their relationships, but goes
Mm-hmm.
beyond them. Why is this important for Fanon? Because Fanon very strongly believed in the importance of a therapeutic relationship. He
Mm-hmm.
very much believed that patients absolutely do enact different interpersonal familial dynamics with the therapist, 100%.
Mm-hmm.
But he also believed that patients aren't just struggling with their attachment schemas or problems in interpersonal relatedness. They're also struggling with, who am I in the world? How does
Mm-hmm.
the community see me? Am I somebody who has value? or are there ways in which I am excluded from the social world? And so given those two things, which I think we talked a little bit earlier, right? The area of like what I call the horizontality of relationships and the verticality of status and power, he believed that when you're encountering a patient for the first time, absolutely you're trying to build a therapeutic relationship, but you're trying to build that relationship by listening to these two dimensions of experience. What are the ways in which the patient tries to find connection? Yes. But also, what are the ways in which the patient tries to find meaning, purpose, positionality in the world? To put it in a very banal way, right? Like, I don't need to be, the best, basketball player. I don't need to be like the best mathematician or the best psychologist. But so long as I'm not at the bottom, I can find my place somewhere in the team, in the community, as it were. So Fanon's very much trying to assess that on a patient by patient basis and listening intently for those ruptures that can emerge in the relationship that may reflect not only an interpersonal attachment related schema, but may also reflect ways in which the patient sees the therapist, not only as somebody with power by virtue of being the therapist, but because of their various perceived and real identities and positionalities in the world, right? So I very clearly, I'm a cis male therapist. So if I'm working with a woman patient, I have to be attuned to the ways in which gender can play a role in the room, but not just gender, but gender perhaps in relation to race and ethnicity, right? So me working with, let's say, a young adult woman of color, it's going to be a little different from my working with a white woman, a middle upper class white woman, right? The dynamics of identity and positionality are going to shift depending on who patient and therapists are. Now, for Fanon, it's also really important not to do this in a heavy-handed way. So to not just assume because you, the patient, are X, Y, and Z, now I know everything there is to know about you because I can depend on what I read on the book chapter on working with X, Y, and Z people. So humility, what we might today call cultural humility, is also very central for Fanon, that you're able to approach the patient in a spirit of not knowing that is open to how both the relational and the social can emerge in the room. Some concrete ways that Fanon addressed this, one, very near and dear to many contemporary therapists, listening for ruptures, right? And to try to notice, well, in what ways that I, as a therapist, contribute to these ruptures, whether they're attachment or societally related or both. But the other is a little more subtle, but very profound and important, which is the quality of our analytic listening. So oftentimes, and I'll give you a great example of this actually. Oftentimes when we listen to patients, right, as therapists, we're trained to listen for interpersonal themes, right? How do they relate to their loved ones? How did their parents take care of them, right? Sometimes that interpersonal, what I call a dyadic focus, leaves out other information that's also relevant. So I remember watching this video when I was in school of an object relations therapist. This was a white woman therapist working with a young adult white male. And in the beginning of the session, this young man is talking about feeling alienated from school, not being able to find work, feeling really strapped, right, by the economic conditions of the time. And as he's talking about this stuff, she's present, right? She's reflecting back and trying to understand his struggles. But it's not until he says, "Oh, and my not being able to find work, it's such a disappointment to my mother." And you can see her suddenly light up. Ah, mother, you say. Tell us more about your mother, right? So it just kind of conveyed the idea that she was listening, she was present, but she was really focusing more on dyadic developmental object relational stuff, not totally attending to the question of class that was present in the room, of a white man in America who's trying to achieve upward mobility and struggling to do so, despite a nation and a country and a history that has says, this world is yours, right? So that was not treated as analytically important material. And in the post game, when they interview the therapist, like, "Oh, what was your technique here? What did you do?" her formulation was a pretty standard object relational formulation of ways in which the patient felt penetrated by their mother, the mother is intrusive, etc. What the decolonial perspective asks us to do is like, yes, of course, parents can be intrusive and do all sorts of things to his kids. What if we zoomed out from just looking at the parent and the kid, and we ask questions about, well, gee, well, what's the parent experience in their history? And not just what did the parent experience, because that becomes a kind of reductio ad absurdum almost of like, well, the parent was that way because their parent was that way to them. But wait a minute. What if we zoom out from the parental relationship entirely? What kind of social, cultural, and historical context may have led these families over time to cope in this way with their problems, right? It's not enough to say, oh, the patient had a parent who struggled with alcohol abuse. But the parents struggle with alcohol abuse because their grandparents struggle with alcohol abuse. Well, wait a minute. Why is it that across the generations there's a struggle with alcohol abuse? Could there be something in the social context that is maintaining the conditions under which these problems happen? Our position is not that we're going to like pedagogically tell our patients, sort of a history lesson on, neoliberalism in the 80s. Rather, that if we're able to attune to that material, the patient is bringing it up as having meaning and purpose and importance, that we might have a broader way of formulating this case that can allow, yes, attachment dynamics to be very central, alongside questions about somebody's place in the world. How do they struggle with paying the bills, for example? What does that reflect to them about their value, right? So it's about expanding our listening and attending to a wide range of material as being equally important to mental health. So that's one, the nature of listening and reflecting back. Two is to be able to pay attention to those more subtle signs of people's positionality in the room and just reflecting them back in order to stimulate, we might say, the patient's broader associative network. So somebody who talks, very generically about, it's like I can't find my place with people. You know what I mean? Like I just can't, I can't seem to get it going. Like sometimes I wonder if people like, I don't know, just see me as like lesser than or something. Very generic, very broad statement. Just being able to reflect that back, like, oh, like you feel like you're treated as lesser than by other people. Like in what ways does that come up, right? So not jumping to conclusions, this is about your gender, race, sexuality, class, but just being able to have that curiosity and to create space for that material is something that's meaningful. Alongside those kind of technical suggestions I make in the book, the bigger point I try to make is that there are different ways of working from a decolonial point of view. So whether you are Freudian, relational, Lacanian, whether you are, my God, cognitive behavioral, there are different ways of working, I would argue, from a decolonial point of view that acknowledges the core technical ingredients of these models, but that also makes space for what Irving Yalom called the throw-ins. So I mentioned this cute little story in the book where Irving Yalom, who's a humanistic therapist, takes this cooking class with an Armenian matriarch. And they take the class and they work with an interpreter to try to follow her recipes, right, to create dishes that are just as delicious as hers. And yet they never quite make it until one day, Yalom is noticing the cooking instructor very closely. And he notices that right when she's done with the things that she teaches them, she hands the dish to an assistant who then throws in all these other spices, all these other condiments that weren't part of the lesson. And he realizes, oh, I think it's those throw-ins that are not part of the recipe. They're not part of the core ingredients, shall we say, of the dish that make it so delicious. He makes the point that probably what makes a lot of good psychotherapy work is not just having a theoretical model. It's not just having a basic way of working, but knowing when and where to be spontaneous, to have these throw-ins that maybe don't exactly fit the theory or the model, but introduce an element of surprise for both patient and therapist. And I track in the book how Freud, Lacan, and Fanon, they all had a model, but they all had a way of shifting beyond the model in order to reach their patients. Well, one quick little anecdote, and then I'll pause here, from Freud, actually, right? You could say whatever you want about, you have to be a blank screen and you can't share your feelings, blah, blah, blah. As I get into in the book, Freud's position is a little more ambiguous. He says in one paper, you have to be a cold surgeon delivering an intervention. And then a year later, he says, you know what? Anything other than empathy is going to derail the treatment. How does that manifest in his clinical practice? He has a patient, a young woman who has had a number of losses as a result of the Spanish flu, very relevant for our times, I think, as a result of the Spanish flu and also the First World War. And as she's talking about her trauma, how she and her daughter got the Spanish flu, but were able to survive it, even though so many people were lost. Freud, who knew that she was struggling to connect with him and feel safe with him, says to her, oh, I remember the Spanish flu very well. I actually lost my daughter to the Spanish flu. And he reaches into his coat pocket and pulls out a locket that has a picture of his daughter in it and shares it with the patient. This was very moving for the patient because it suggested that Freud wasn't just the opaque guru who doesn't share anything with anyone, who shows no vulnerability, but actually maybe he was a human being who could understand her pain, right? I will say, Freud doesn't write about his more tender moments in psychotherapy, but his patients snitched and they wrote about it. And so we know that he was actually capable of a lot more flexibility than is often given credit for. And that, I think, is part of what makes psychotherapy work. It's having a model, certainly having techniques that you use, but also knowing when and where to go beyond that in a way that, again, brings something new to the patient's experience. It's surprising, maybe a little shocking, and then becomes mutative for both the patient and the therapist. In other words, it's not just the patient who changes over the course of therapy. It is a therapist who must change with them in order for the work to do its thing.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Like my mind is moving to all of the different places, right? As you
Oh,
talk about,
great.
yeah, flexibility and also like the intergenerational component that you talked a bit about. It brought me back to like the memory when even before I was practicing, I worked with with the indigenous community in Arizona for a bit, and I was fine working with the families there. I was like a family support specialist. I specifically work with families that lost custody of a child, right? So I'll go into these homes in the reservations, and I will sit with the mom that lost custody, and I'll sit in the home with all of these people, right? And there's history of substance use and all of this stuff, right? And that was present, whatever the reason was that they lost custody. And the reasons, and they'll give me all of these reasons, right? My supervisor at the time was a therapist. I mean, she was a social worker, and she was like, you're not doing your job. You're supposed to like be a case manager and helping them do this and this and this. You're sitting with them. I'm like, because I'm really interested because I knew about history. So I had the historical context. Then I started learning about the community. Okay, the grandma's in the room. Oh, the grandma was put in boarding school, right? And this and this and start to learn. Okay, when does the shift happen in this community in Arizona, right? Arizona's a 48th state, right? Um, so just even starting to notice that there wasn't just like, oh, substance use, dad used substance, grandfather used substance, right? What were they coping with? Okay, we have this huge incident that happened here. Whatever it was, like 80 years ago at the time, right? I don't know how long ago it was. And to be able to even like start balancing, okay, this is the way that they started to cope with this, and they lost the way that they ate, and then their style of even like educating and all these different things. So of course people found different ways to cope, right? And understanding that concept was like huge for me because I could have focused in there and kind of like, hey, mom, can you stop using drugs? Here's the drug counselor. You need to go see him, which is fine, right? But to understand there's a deeper thing that was happening in that space, which is what led me to become a therapist eventually.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, and that flexibility is huge. I think in social work they have the concept of use of self, and sometimes it can be used in a very, I guess, simplistic way. But if you actually look at it, you're bringing yourself into the room and how to use that in a very attentive way, right? And being aware of it. Okay, what I'm bringing into this room, and how do I name this? And and bringing in the flexibility of it, like what do I throw in, right? What do I know? And to be
Mm-hmm.
able to say like, hey, like, I guess given that historical context with the Native Americans, like, how was it for you guys? Whatever. Can I ask grandma this question? No, grandma never speaks, but can I ask her this question about how was it for
Mm-hmm.
her when she was put in boarding school? And grandma like, oh yeah, and starts talking, right? Like, oh, we never,
Yeah.
and the family never knew the story, right? So that sort of
Oh,
forward,
wow.
but just even think about it in that sort of way. Any last thing that you want to share with us, Daniel or Daniel Jose?
Oh man. I mean, just jumping off of that example, that's so powerful, right? Because it's exactly taking that time to hear the story that built a relationship, right? And this is
Mm-hmm.
something I get into the book, that the relationship is not just dyadic,
Mm-hmm.
it is systemic, right? It includes everything in the patient's world and in your world that leads the two of you come together, right? So if you had
Mm-hmm.
come in with like, oh, hey mom, drugs are bad, okay, you got to
Mm-hmm.
do this counselor thing, there would have probably been some understandable reactance
Mm-hmm.
in order to maintain their integrity, because the community has probably had people coming in all the time and telling them
Mm-hmm.
what to do, where they got to go,
Yeah.
right? So there's like a way in which there was the possibility of something being enacted there that would have
Mm-hmm.
reproduced those kind of colonial dynamics, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the last thing I would want to say, just connecting back this idea that like there's work that we do in the room that can have that social and political texture, even though it's oriented
Mm-hmm.
towards the patient's growth. I do believe there's got to be being able to take those stories, right,
Mm-hmm.
and have them inform how one is in the world as a citizen, as a political actor,
Mm-hmm.
whether or not, right, a specific therapist necessarily decides to get involved in political action. I
Mm-hmm.
think it is important to let patient stories and experiences impact and inform how we think about politics and what kind
Mm-hmm.
of world it is that we want to push for.
Mm-hmm.
The that forgive me, I don't know if I shared with you the metaphor of the starfish.
No, I don't
Spoke a
remember.
little earlier. So it just very briefly, it's a classic, very beautiful story that I always
Mm-hmm.
find very compelling. Where like a man is walking down a beach and he sees a little girl, and she's like taking all these starfish and throwing them back into the sea.
Mm-hmm.
And in one telling of the story, the man says like, "Oh, why are you throwing these starfish back into the sea? They're just going to get washed up again."
Mm-hmm.
And her answer is, well, it mattered to that one,
Yeah.
right? Now, it's a beautiful story for many of us who are in social work, clinical
Mm-hmm.
and counseling, psychiatry,
Mm-hmm.
right? That working with a singular person matters. As I
Mm-hmm.
think Frida from Reitman was put it, to change a person is to change the world. And I agree with
Mm-hmm.
that. But there is the original draft of the story, which is a little different.
Mm-hmm.
In the original draft, when the little girl says it mattered to that one, the man is so moved that he actually pitches in to help her throw the starfish
Mm-hmm.
back into the sea. And
Yeah.
he says, maybe if I join with her, others will join with her too, so
Mm-hmm.
that it will no longer just be the little girl
Mm-hmm.
trying to save the starfish, right? And that points in a much more communal
Mm-hmm.
and collective direction.
Yeah.
My fantasy, if there were to be a sequel to the story, is that the little girl grows up and she becomes a maritime biologist, a marine biologist.
Mm-hmm.
And she's like, well, wait a minute. Why are so many starfish washing up on the beach? And she
Mm-hmm.
does research and she's like, oh, global warming is
Mm-hmm.
leading for the starfish to wind up in the sea. Well, what's causing global warming?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, there are these major corporations that are
Mm-hmm.
helping pollute our environment
Yeah.
and raise the planet's temperature. Well, why are they able to get away with that? Oh, we got lobbyists and major politicians who are fronting for them. Why are they
Mm-hmm.
able to do that? Oh, wait, they're able to use racism and division to maintain control so that they can enact these policies that ultimately trickle down into starfish winding up by the beach. I share that story because I think there's a model there for how clinicians and therapists could think about their work. Like, yes, absolutely help the person in front of you as you should, right? I would never tell a therapist not to do therapy any more than I would tell a cardiologist not to do open heart surgery. But I just make an invitation for us to think more broadly about the symptoms we hear about in the room. That yes, they have a familial source, they have an intergenerational familial source, but beyond the family, there's a broader world that also contributes to that suffering. Can we tilt our ears to listen analytically, not just to the personal unconscious, but also the social unconscious, and to use that to meditate, not just in how to help people, to borrow from dialectical behavior therapy, not just how to help people build a life worth living, but also how to imagine building a world worth living in. And that's what I like to, share with you all, with your listeners.
Thank you, Daniel. Where can we find your work quickly before we run out of time here?
I mean, you can find my work at online bookstores worldwide. Your Amazons. You can find A People's History of Psychoanalysis at the Lexington Publishers website. Decolonizing Psychoanalytic Technique. You can find at the Prager Publishers website. I also have my own personal website where I list my book, my talks, my things, and then also have a research website focused on my research laboratory at Queens College. And then there's, of course, my faculty page where there's my contact information. So either through my websites or my faculty page, people can reach out to me. I am not really on the social medias like that. If anything, I just lurk to find out cocktail recipes or video games or whatever, but I don't really post like that, so don't look for me there. Just send me a good old-fashioned email, and we can get to talking.
Yeah. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for having you. Thank you for taking the time to be with us.
Oh, thank you so much. You all take care.
Yeah, thank you.